Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on chi-squared. This is another one of our series of the Module 6 Part 2 series where we're having a look at obviously those different patterns of inheritance. And in this video we'll be having a look at specification reference 6.1.2c using the chi-squared test to determine the significance of the difference between observed and expected results. And remember, all the way through this video where we're looking at a stats test, if you are expected to calculate chi-squared, then you will be provided with the formula in the question that you are required to use it in. No need to memorize it, no need to worry about formula sheets, etc. It will literally just be printed right there in the actual question. Okay, so when we're thinking about when we're able to use chi-squared, then we can use it if we have a large sample size. The data that we have in front of us are raw counts, so they haven't been processed into anything weird like percentages, etc. Just literally numbers. We have no zero scores in the data, and that we've got categories but not continuous data, so we need discrete categories really for this. And the last thing that we need in order to use chi-squared is a strong biological theory that we can use to predict expected values. Okay, so watch out for questions to do with chi-squared about what we would need in order to actually be able to use chi-squared. So large sample size, raw counts of data, strong biological theory to predict the expected values, and those discrete categories, not continuous data, are kind of those key things. Learn at least 3 and then you should be able to answer any question for max marks on that one. Okay, so before we can delve into the actual calculation, we need to understand what the null hypothesis for our chi-squared test would be. And the null hypothesis just states that there is no statistically significant difference between the observed and the expected data. Therefore, any difference that we may see between those two sets of values will be down to chance. So even though you're going to be provided with the formula for chi-squared in any question you need to use it, do make sure you understand what each of the bits actually means. Otherwise, we can give you as many formulas as we like. If you don't know what the bits mean and how to actually use it, it's not going to go very well. So what we need to do then is understand these key parts of the formula, okay? First of all, this lovely little Greek letter here just stands for sum of. So what we're going to do is basically add together all of the values that we get from this calculation on this side. Now where we see O, that means the observed value, E is the expected value, and do note what we're doing on that right hand side. So we've got O minus E, so your observed minus the expected, and then we're going to square that value. Once we've squared it, we then divide it by the expected, and you do that for each pair of values that you've got before adding them all together to give you your value of chi-squared. So do make sure that you know how to use your calculator properly, because otherwise errors are going to happen here, folks, okay? If you just start typing lots of numbers into your calculator, they can do strange things, so please make sure that you have got your calculator that you will be using in your A-level exam well in advance. You've practiced, you've made sure you know how to use it, you know the sequence of any weird little button presses that you may need to do for any particular thing, so that you're not just having to learn in the day of the exam. So before we delve into an actual example of how we calculate this then, a couple of little points to note here. Those differences that we have between the observed and the expected could be positive or they could be negative. So what we do is we actually square it, as you can see in that formula, because otherwise when we start to create a sum of this, we're going to have some positive, some negative, and it's then going to create some issues for us. So basically the squaring it means that they will all be positive at the end there. And the last point there, dividing by the expected, is actually giving us a way to take into account the size of those numbers themselves. So what we're able to generate then is our final chi-squared value, which we're then going to be able to use against the table of data to work out if it is significant or not. Okay, before we have a look at an example, let's have a quick look at the steps we're going to have. In order to actually carry out the full chi-squared test, we will need to calculate chi-squared, and we'll go through the exact way to do that in a moment. We then need to work out the number of degrees of freedom that we have in our given context. We then may be asked to work out a p-value from a distribution table. Sometimes in the question they will just give that to you, but sometimes you'll be given a section of one of these distribution tables and you have to pick the right p-value, and we'll have a look at how you do that in a moment. And then once we've got all those bits of information, we've got to make that final statement. Is that difference significant at the particular level of probability that we are examining? So those are our 4 key steps to going all the way through this from start to finish, basically from that point of having raw data to your final conclusion. But what we're going to do is go through each of those one bit at a time to really break it down so you understand how to do this. Okay, here is our set of data that we're going to be looking at. We've got our lovely little data table here, and we have 4 different categories. These are our lovely pea seeds, if we're going back to a bit of Mendel. We've got yellow round ones, green round ones, yellow wrinkled, and green wrinkled. So we've got 4 different categories of pea seed, basically. Now, what we then have is our next column here is the observed value. So basically, we went round and we counted our pea plants and we had a look to see how many of those pea plants had yellow round seeds, etc. And then we wrote down the raw value into our table. We then have our expected column, and this comes from that biological theory. Now, as we've seen earlier in this topic, we do have those very clear ratios for different scenarios. So in this case, we've got a dihybrid inheritance, which means that we're looking at the 9:3:3:1 ratio. And from that, we can then work out, obviously, the expected values. Because if we've got 288 pea plants, then obviously this adds up. Now 9 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1 is going to give us our 16. So once you've got that, all we need to do is 288, okay, and then we're just going to times that by, and for the yellow round ones, 9 divided by 16. So when we're doing that, that's going to give us our expected value of 162. And you just do that same thing to get all your other expected values if they weren't provided for you. Now in this case we've been given them, so that's just an aside for the other type of question that could exist. What we're then going to do is work out these next 3 columns together, okay? Typically on these chi-squared questions, you get at least an outline of a table, if not part of it already filled in for you. Now, if it's just an outline of a table, then clearly you need to remember the sequence of headings that we're going to place in there to allow you to calculate it. If obviously you've got parts with headings, just do what it tells you to do, really. And remember, use a calculator. As much as you might think you are really good at mental maths, you're going to be sitting your A-level biology exams. They matter. You hopefully care about these. Therefore, you're going to be a bit nervous, and when you're nervous, stupid errors creep in. So use a calculator just to be sure. Okay, so our first column that we're going to do any calculations for is O minus E. So all we do here is whatever the observed value is minus the expected. So 169 minus 162 gives us 7. 54, 0. 51 minus 54 is going to give us minus 3. And then 14 minus 18 gives us minus 4. Now you'll notice that I'm actually writing down all this working rather than just chucking it in a calculator and putting a final answer, because as we've said, silly errors happen. If all you've done is write down a final answer, that silly error has cost you all marks on the question. If you've shown you're working, at least we can hopefully unpick it and therefore give you some of the marks on the question. Okay, the next column along, O minus E squared. So we've got our O minus E. Now we're going to square it. So 7 squared is 49, 0 squared, just 0, minus 3 squared is positive 9, minus 4 squared is positive 16. So we've then got our values. What we then have to do is divide each of those by E. Now when we're looking at this, obviously what we're going to be doing is 49 divided by the expected for that row, which is 162. So always remember to use the expected for that row on your table. So that gives us 0.30. The next one we're going to have is going to be obviously 0 divided by 54, which is still 0. Then we're going to have 9 divided by 54, and that gives us 0.17. And then our final one, 16 divided by 18, and that gives us 0.88. So do notice how I've written all of my answers to the same number of decimal places in the table there as well. So think about our formula again. Once we've calculated O minus E squared over E, we then have to do the sum of. So what we're going to do is add each of these, and that's going to give us a total of 1.35. So we've now calculated our value for chi-squared there. The next thing we need to do then is to work out the number of degrees of freedom that we are dealing with in this particular context. So if we think about how to do this, it's quite simple. It's your number of categories minus 1. So in the example we just looked at, we had yellow and round, we had green and round, yellow and wrinkled, green and wrinkled. We had 4 categories. So to work out the degrees of freedom, 4 minus 1 gives us 3. It really is that straightforward. So degrees of freedom, however many categories there are, minus 1 gives you that. Now this part, as I say, sometimes you will have to use one of these little tables. It will be printed in the question space. It won't be as big as this one, don't panic. There'll be a small section with bits that you're likely to use incorrectly. Other questions, they're just going to tell you what the p-value is. Okay, so the p-value is basically the value we're going to be comparing our chi-squared value to work out, is this significant or not? So what we need to do here is, number 1, read the question. If obviously they've given you the p-value, fab, just use it. If they haven't, and we've got a section of one of these tables, we need to work out where we're looking. Okay, now first of all, what we've got here, this little column df, that's our degrees of freedom. So if we remember in our example, we've got 3 degrees of freedom, so we're coming across this row here with the 3. What we now need to work out is, where are we actually reading? Because we've got a whole row of values there. Which one do we want to look at? Now quite often the questions are going to be asking you for 95%. But do read the question, okay? So some of them will have 95% at the top, others you're going to obviously have to use the reverse. So what we'd be looking for at 95% is going to be 0.05. Because obviously if you do 95 divided by 100, that gives you 0.95, and therefore we're looking at the 0.05, the difference between that and 100. If we were having a look at, say, what would we have, 90%, then what we would be doing is having a look at the 0.1 column next to it. Okay, so do look carefully to make sure you are looking down the correct column, and remember what they're going to do is they're going to give you a section of this table that's going to have 4 degrees and 3 degrees of freedom at least, because a lot of people will get it wrong. Okay, so they'll look at the 4 degrees of freedom, not the 3. So make sure you're looking at the right point, and all we then do is we come along and down, and where we then get that intersection of those 2 points, that is the value we need to compare to. That's our critical value. Okay, 7.815 in our little table. So in our example then, our critical value that we're using is 7.815. If you remember, our chi-squared value is 1.35. So that's what we calculated a couple of steps ago. In terms of what we now need to do, we just need to compare our chi-squared value to that critical value. And if our chi-squared value is below the critical value, we are going to accept the null hypothesis. And that means that any difference we had between the observed and the expected is down to chance, and therefore it is not significant. If, however, our chi-squared value is above the critical value, we reject the null hypothesis and we will accept the experimental hypothesis. And that means that the difference that we can see between observed and expected is significant, and it's not down to chance. It is caused by whatever we said in the actual hypothesis for this experiment. So what we need to do in terms of writing these answers is get used to making a couple of clear kind of points in your structure. Your first point is always that comparison between your chi-squared and the critical value. So make that explicit comparison. The value of chi-squared was this, critical value is this, therefore our value is above, below. Okay, so make that first statement. Secondly, say whether you are going to accept or reject the null hypothesis. So the next part of your statement will always be, therefore we accept or we reject the null hypothesis, and then follow it up with what that actually means. So obviously if we're accepting the null hypothesis, the difference is due to chance and is not significant. If we're rejecting the null hypothesis, that means that the difference is significant between our observed and expected, and therefore it is not due to chance. So our third point on there is give that detail as we explain what it means. And if you do that, then you should be able to get full marks on any of those comparison of your chi-squared value to the critical value questions, those conclusion type ones, okay? As always, I hope you found this video useful, and of course don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when more videos are uploaded, and head on over to the website where you can find a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.